In 2021, more than 47 million Americans voluntarily walked away from their jobs in a single year. Not fired. Not laid off. They chose to leave. That number is so staggering it forced economists, CEOs, and government officials to completely rethink everything they believed about work, loyalty, and what people actually want from their lives. And the reason behind it will challenge assumptions you probably did not even know you were making. In the next 10 minutes, you are going to understand exactly what triggered this historic wave of resignations, why it was not simply about money, and what the data actually reveals about the deeper shifts happening in how human beings relate to work. There is one insight buried inside this story that most business analysts still refuse to fully acknowledge, because accepting it would mean admitting that the entire structure of modern employment was already broken long before the pandemic arrived. To understand the Great Resignation, you have to go back further than 2021. You have to go back decades. The relationship between employers and employees in the 20th century was built on an unspoken agreement. Workers traded their time, energy, and loyalty in exchange for stability, benefits, and the promise of a predictable future. That agreement began fracturing in the 1980s when large-scale layoffs became a standard corporate strategy rather than a last resort. Pensions disappeared. Job security eroded. The bargain became increasingly one-sided, yet most workers stayed because the alternative seemed worse. Quitting without another job lined up carried enormous social stigma and financial risk. So millions of people remained in jobs that drained them, telling themselves it was simply how life worked. Then 2020 arrived and shattered every assumption in a matter of weeks. When the pandemic forced global lockdowns, something unexpected happened inside people's minds. Confronted with mortality, isolation, and the sudden collapse of routine, workers everywhere began asking a question they had long suppressed. Is this actually worth it? For many, the honest answer was no. But here is what nobody talks about often enough. The Great Resignation did not begin in 2021. Resignations actually dropped sharply in early 2020 when uncertainty peaked. People held on, afraid to jump. What happened in 2021 was a delayed detonation. Workers spent months quietly planning, saving, and building the courage to leave. When the economy stabilized enough to make movement feel possible, they moved all at once. The numbers are extraordinary. The United States Bureau of Labor Statistics recorded 4.3 million resignations in just the month of August 2021 alone. That single month broke every previous record. By the end of that year, the monthly average was hovering around 3.9 million. Industries like hospitality, retail, and healthcare were hit hardest. Restaurant chains reported turnover rates exceeding 130% annually, meaning they were effectively replacing their entire staff more than once per year. And this was not uniquely American. The United Kingdom saw resignation rates climb to their highest point since records began. In Australia, job mobility reached a 14-year peak. Germany reported historic labor shortages. The phenomenon was global, which immediately tells you something important. This was not about one country's politics or one economy's quirks. Something universal was driving it. So what was actually driving it? Researchers from MIT, Harvard, and numerous independent economic institutions began dissecting the data, and what they found dismantled the simple narrative that people were quitting because of low wages. Wages were certainly a factor, but they ranked third or fourth in most comprehensive studies. The top reasons workers cited were toxic workplace culture, lack of respect from management, poor work-life balance, and the absence of any meaningful flexibility. A landmark study published in MIT Sloan Management Review analyzed 34 million employee profiles and found that toxic culture was 10.4 times more powerful than compensation as a predictor of resignation. Let that number sit for a moment. People were not leaving for more money nearly as often as they were leaving to escape environments that made them feel worthless. The pandemic did something psychologically profound. It gave people physical distance from their workplaces, and that distance created perspective. Remote workers who had spent years defending their ability to work from home suddenly proved beyond any reasonable doubt that productivity did not require an office. And yet many companies began pushing for a return to in-person work, often framing it as a cultural necessity while offering no real evidence to support the claim. Workers who had tasted autonomy were being asked to surrender it. Millions decided they would rather leave. Healthcare workers represent one of the most revealing case studies. These were people who had been celebrated as heroes throughout 2020, applauded from balconies, featured on magazine covers. Then, as 2021 progressed, they faced chronic understaffing, inadequate personal protective equipment, administrative burdens that had nothing to do with patient care, and burnout so severe that clinical terms like moral injury entered mainstream conversation. A survey by Morning Consult found that nearly 1 in 5 healthcare workers quit their jobs during the pandemic period. The heroes had been asked to sacrifice endlessly while systemic problems went unaddressed. What emerged from this mass departure was something economists call a revaluation of time. Workers began pricing their hours differently. A generation that had watched parents work themselves into exhaustion only to face layoffs during the 2008 financial crisis was not willing to repeat that pattern. Millennials and Generation Z workers, who together make up the majority of the current labor force, entered the workforce with different values than previous generations. Work was not meant to be the center of identity. Purpose, flexibility, and well-being were non-negotiable. The pandemic simply accelerated a collision between those values and the traditional employment model that was always coming. But here is what nobody talks about in the mainstream analysis. A significant portion of the Great Resignation was not people quitting to find better jobs. It was people restructuring their entire economic lives. Some retired early, drawing down savings they had accumulated during lockdowns when spending dropped sharply. Others launched small businesses or freelance careers. The number of new business applications in the United States reached record highs in 2021, exceeding 5.4 million, a 53% increase over 2019 levels. The resignation was not just an exodus from jobs. It was a mass experiment in economic self-determination. Companies that failed to respond lost institutional knowledge, trained personnel, and customer relationships that took years to build. The cost of replacing a single employee is estimated by the Society for Human Resource Management to be roughly 6 to 9 months of that employee's salary. Multiply that by millions of departures and you begin to understand why corporate profits took hits that no balance sheet had anticipated. The organizations that retained their people did something simple. They listened and then actually changed. Microsoft introduced permanent flexible work policies. Salesforce redesigned its office spaces to function as collaboration hubs rather than mandatory daily locations. Smaller companies offered 4-day work weeks and reported no meaningful decline in output. The evidence for worker-centric policies was accumulating rapidly, and companies that acted on it early stopped the bleeding. The deeper lesson from the Great Resignation is about power. For decades, the employment relationship had an inherent imbalance. Employers held most of the leverage because the cost of unemployment was catastrophic for individuals. The pandemic briefly redistributed that power. Labor shortages meant workers could demand more, refuse less, and walk away from conditions they had previously tolerated out of fear. The question now is whether that shift in power has lasting effects or whether it was a temporary disruption that the old structures will eventually absorb. Early signs suggest it is somewhere in between. Remote and hybrid work has become a permanent feature of many industries, which represents a genuine structural change. But wage gains in low-income sectors are already being eroded by inflation. Some industries are quietly walking back flexibility promises made during the talent shortage. The rebalancing of power, it seems, is partial and ongoing. What the Great Resignation ultimately taught us is that the contract between workers and employers was never as fixed as it appeared. When circumstances changed enough, millions of people rewrote their terms. They demanded dignity, flexibility, and purpose, not as luxury requests but as baseline requirements. And for one brief, remarkable period, they had the leverage to make those demands stick. The workplace has changed. Before you go, if you learned something valuable today, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Flash Trend for a brand new video every single day. We will see you in the next one.